Okay, today I wanted to talk about heat stress. There's a couple of really good readings in your reading assignment on heat stress. One is from the journal Professional Safety that I think is a very, very good overview of this subject. But I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about a little bit of why this is a problem. First of all, the core body temperature is maintained in a very narrow range. It's usually 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. And if you get into conditions where the temperature drops a little bit, it's called hypothermia, and death can occur at 27 degrees Celsius. Or just a few degrees over the core temperature, you can get into a condition of hyperthermia, where death can occur at 42 degrees Celsius. Now, how is heat generated in the body? Well, two ways. One is the metabolism of nutrients. Every time you eat something, you're taking in a certain amount of energy. This energy is measured in calories, so you want to know how many calories you're going to be eating. And most of us burn about 2,000 to 3,000 calories per day. And that burning of those nutrients, that metabolism of the nutrients, will generate heat. So that's one way that we generate heat within our bodies. The second way is muscle contraction. As we move our muscles, energy is going to be released. And as I say down in the bottom, physical work sharply increases generation of internal heat, and heat produced is proportional to effort expended, i.e., the harder you work, the hotter you're going to get. So those are the two ways that you generate heat within your body: the metabolism of nutrients and by muscle contraction, which is physical work that will generate heat. Now, how do we control it? Well, there's a couple ways that the body controls temperature, because remember, it's got to stay in a very narrow range. If we get out of that range, we can get into conditions of hypo or hyperthermia. So this is very tightly controlled and regulated. One way is by a central nervous system mechanism. The part of your brain called the hypothalamus is responsible for control of body temperature regulation, and it can do that to a certain extent. The other way is we have certain feedback and regulatory mechanisms that will start working once we get to conditions where the body gets a little hot or a little cold. One thing that occurs for a regulatory mechanism is blood will circulate to the skin. If you're starting to get too hot, you'll have an increased blood flow to the skin. That will help the core body temperature cool down by having this exchange between more blood to the larger surface area of the skin and back to the core again. And people that start to get hot will have a flushed appearance on their face. It turns a little red, and this is due to the increased blood circulation. The other thing that we can do is evaporate sweat. And the more sweat we can produce, the cooler we can keep the core temperature. And this is going to work by a couple things will affect it. First of all, the more exposed skin surface you have, the better the evaporation of sweat is going to be. The relative humidity is going to have an effect on it, because the higher the relative humidity, the more difficult it is to cool off from evaporation of sweat. And air movement. If you turn a fan on, it's going to be easier to utilize sweat evaporation than if the air is still. So exposed skin, relative humidity, air movement will all play a role in the ability of the body to cool itself down through the evaporation of sweat. And the last thing is the heart rate. That when you start to get into conditions where it's too hot and you've started increasing the blood circulation, evaporating sweat, you can increase the heart rate, and that will help get more blood out to the cooler surface so that it can cool down the core. So these are your regulatory mechanisms that are involved in body temperature regulation. Now, different people exposed to the same heat load will respond differently, and there's various reasons why that may be so. And I have some of those listed here on factors that really make a person's response to heat different. One is acclimatization. And what acclimatization refers to is the more you're exposed to a hot environment, the more used to it you become. So people who are used to working in hot climates do better than those who are new at working in those environments. So there's a process of adaptation that your body will do. It usually takes a week or two to acclimatize to a hotter temperature. The second thing is some people are taking prescription drugs. There's a fairly sizable number of Americans, especially when they get into middle age, that have blood pressure issues, for example. And one of the common types of medications prescribed for blood pressure are diuretics, which pulls the fluid away from the body. and by increasing the amount of urine produced. And so a person's a little bit dehydrated when they take some of these types of medications. And if they get in hot environments, when they're taking diuretics, for example, they are going to have a more difficult time adapting to heat than a person that's not on prescription medication. So prescription drugs can play a role as well. In addition, recreational drugs and alcohol can also play a role in response to heat stress. If a workforce goes out and drinks fairly heavily the night before they're reporting to work the next day, and they wear a level A suit when it's a hot environment, they're going to be severely dehydrated from the effects of alcohol, and that could lead to a heat stress incident. So recreational drugs and alcohol can be problematic as well. In addition, the older you get, the more difficult it is to acclimate to heat properly. And physical conditioning makes a difference. And athletes that are going to be performing in conditions where it's really hot, like marathon runners where it'll be 95 degrees, or football players where they're in pads and it's 100 degrees on the field, physical conditioning will help them adapt to heat stress a lot better. Now, for the industrial hygiene world, we have some types of recommendations we have on making sure the core body temperature doesn't get too hot. And we try to calculate this by means of what we call a heat flow equation. And I have it written here where M plus or minus R plus or minus C minus E is equal to 0. And this is an equation of trying to make sure that the core body temperature stays within a very narrow range, hopefully 0. It's not going to change at all. But what it does is takes into account all the different factors that can play a role in heat flow within a body. The first is M, which is metabolism. And again, this is the type of heat that's produced from the caloric content of the different foods that you eat. So that's going to be something that's produced in the by burning a certain number of calories. R and C are environmental type of heat components, and these can be either positive or negative. If it's cold outside, the R and C can be negative. If it's hot outside, the R and C can be positive. But radiative and convective heat transfer, radiative from a solar body to yourself, convective from the surrounding environment directly to yourself, the air, are going to be a contribution to how much additional heat stress is on the body. And E is evaporation. Heat is always lost due to evaporation, so E is always negative. So again, the heat flow equation is M plus or minus R plus or minus C minus E is equal to 0, where M is the heat production due to metabolism, R is radiative heat transfer, C is convective heat transfer, and E is heat lost due to evaporation. Now, this is a chart that goes over really how that heat flow equation works. And we'll start in the left-hand side in the middle, muscle metabolism. Muscle metabolism is going to influence how much heat there is onto the body. And you can see external work directly below that. The more you work, the more heat is going to be generated. And that's ultimately going to influence the core temperature, which is up on the upper left-hand side. So you have the core temperature that's being increased by any type of muscle metabolism, and the harder they work, the more heat that's going into the core temperature. Now, how does the body cool down the core? Well, it's going to take warmer blood from the core and circulate it out to the skin. And then the cooler blood from the skin is going to come back and cool down the core. So that's what you see on the top, the relationship between the core temperature and the skin. But it gets more complicated. If you look over to the right-hand side, directly below skin, you'll see environment, and that's your R and C, your radiative and convective heat. They can either add heat onto the skin or take heat away, depending if it's colder or warmer than the skin is. So that's going to be playing a role. And then the other arrow on the left is sweat evaporation, and that is going to be always making the skin cooler. So you can see the core is going to be influenced by the amount of muscle metabolism or work that's occurring, which is going to heat the core up, and the core is going to be cooled down by circulating warmer blood to the skin, recirculating that cooler blood back to the core, And this can be influenced by the environment, the radiative and conductive heat, as well as the amount of sweat evaporation, which serves to cool the skin down. This is a relationship on what's happening as the heat load is increasing, and the heat load is expressed by the metabolic heat, the radiative, and convective heat. And that's down on the bottom. You see heat load M plus R plus C. The units are kilocalories per hour. Kilocalories is really the unit for calories. If something is if you eat some yogurt that's 100 calories, it's actually 100 kilocalories. So that's the type of a measurement that we're looking at. And on the left, on the y-axis, we see physiological response. Now, if you take the starting point 0 and you look at the core temperature is going to be in a narrow range, heart rate's going to start off at about 110, sweating is going to be pretty minimal of 0, and metabolism, i.e. calories that you're burning just to stay alive, is going to be a certain number. Now, as you start increasing the heat load, and what are you doing when you're increasing the heat load? I used football earlier. Let's say you have full pads on, it's a summer day, and you're starting to jog around the track, and then you start to do some sprints. The more work you do, the more heat load that's going to influence you. So what's going to happen? Well, the first thing you note that's going to happen is look at sweating. As you increase the heat load, sweating is going to start spiking, really. It's going to get higher and higher. You see a pretty steep slope, and that will work up to a certain range. If you look at the heart rate, below that, the heart rate goes up as well, but not nearly as fast as sweating. Sweating is going up pretty fast. The heart rate is going up a little faster as well, and the core temperature is staying pretty constant. So we have this zone of full compensation. That's between the two dotted arrows in the middle, where you can pretty much maintain that core temperature based upon sweating a lot and your heart rate going up. Now, what happens in the time-limited compensation? This is over on the right, the area between the two dashed lines on the right. This is where things start getting problematic. Metabolism doesn't change too much. You see it goes up a little bit. But sweating is going to peak and then start to level off. And this is because there's only so much sweating you can do. Your body is limited by how much sweat it can produce. There comes a point where it can simply not produce enough sweat to cool down. And when that happens, look what happens directly below it. Your heart rate is going to try to compensate for the lack of sweating by rising exponentially. It's up over 180 beats a minute at that particular time when you're in this zone of limited compensation. And look at the core temperature below it. You hit a point under that heat load where you can no longer control the core temperature, and this is going to be a life-threatening condition. So sweating, increased heart rate can help until you get to time-limited compensation range, at which point the core temperature is going to start increasing and some serious consequences can occur. So this graph kind of ties together the physiological responses under various heat loads and what will happen when you get into a heat load that the body can no longer compensate for. But what will happen to you when you start getting into those type of situations? Well, there are several things that can occur, and I have them listed here. There are various heat disorders that can happen. One is heat rash, one is heat cramps, one is heat exhaustion, and the final and most serious is heat stroke. And I like this chart to try to talk through them a little bit, and we'll look at all of these different things on the chart. We'll start off first of all, on the upper left-hand corner. And on the upper left-hand corner, we can see the core temperature that's being increased by the RNC factors, and the blood flow out to the skin is going to be circulating to try to cool down the core. The skin temperature will hopefully stay within a range to make sure the body's core temperature does not increase too much. But what will first occur, as we saw in the previous slide type of chart, is that the core temperature will try to cool down by sweating. And when you sweat and you get into sustained sweating, one of the first things that can happen is heat rash. And so sustained sweating may lead to heat rash, and you can see that kind of in the middle of the chart. The other thing that can happen from increased sweating is that you're going to be losing a lot of electrolytes, a lot of salt, and a lot of water. and this can lead to dehydration and heat cramps, and that's another one of the outcomes that can occur from the increased sweating. Now, the third thing that can occur, and we can look at skin blood flow and look at the dotted line that comes up from that and goes off to the far right of heat exhaustion. And this is where you're just really getting very, very tired from the increased sweating, your heart rate going up, etc. And people can pass out from this because there's water loss, etc. that's occurring, and that may be one outcome. But down in the far right-hand corner, you see heat stroke. And this is the most serious. This is where inadequate cooling is occurring. Sweat gland fatigue has occurred. The body can no longer sweat anymore. It can't cool itself down. You're in a condition of uncontrolled heat storage. And where you see uncontrolled heat storage, over to the left of that, it's personal risk factors. And this is where things like age, acclimatization, drug and alcohol use, physical conditioning come into play, that some people are simply going to be at higher risk than others for this condition of uncontrollable heat storage. And if not treated, this can lead to heat stroke and a potentially serious medical condition. And this is a chart that just has a little bit more description on each of these, on what heat stroke is, what heat exhaustion is, dehydration, heat syncope, heat cramps, and heat. I can't see what the bottom one is. Heat rash down at the bottom. I'm sorry. That little symbol's on my screen, but heat rash, where you have the itchy skin and skin eruptions. But these are all discussed a little bit, and they're talked about in your reading as well. But it does give a little bit more thorough signs and symptoms of what a person's going to feel like. When you get into heat stroke, you'll have chills, and when you have heat exhaustion, fatigue, dehydration, no early signs, but you'll have fatigue, dry mouth, heat cramps, painful muscle cramps, and it has a column of signs of what happens, what's the cause, and we discussed the causes already and what you can do about it on first aid and how to prevent it. So it's a pretty comprehensive chart about how this process works. Now, the next topic that I wanted to talk on heat stress is how do we measure it? How do we know when we're going to be in an environment where heat stress could potentially occur? And what we do is different types of environmental measurements. And we have a couple that we try to measure. We try to measure the air temperature. This is assessed by a dry bulb, which is something that's shielded from the sun. We try to assess the relative humidity and heat velocity because those are going to affect how well a person can sweat. And we're going to try to assess the radiant temperature. So we're looking by our environmental measurements of getting some measurement of those R plus C components. And we do that by trying to assess air temperature, humidity, air velocity, and radiant temperature. And we do this in industrial hygiene with what's called a wet bulb globe temperature. And this is a picture of an instrumentation of a WBGT, or wet bulb globe temperature. On the left, what we have is a globe temperature where we're measuring radiant heat. Then in the center, we have a dry bulb where we're getting the ambient air temperature. And on the far right, we have kind of an interesting thermometer probe. What we're doing with this is we have a wick of some kind of cotton material that we wet down. And the faster that evaporates, the lower the relative humidity or higher the wind velocity. So this is a measurement really of temperature under relative humidity and wind velocity conditions, which will give a good surrogate measurement on how well a person can sweat under those kind of conditions. So we take these three different temperatures and we assess them to try to mimic what a person's going to be feeling and how well they're going to be able to cool themselves when working in an environment where there's a specified heat load. And this is an example of an outdoor setup of a wet bulb globe temperature. It's just another type of instrumentation for measuring the same thing. Most of what you'll see is on the previous, which is what a lot of IHs use. And the way that this measurement is actually used is to come up with a heat stress index for a wet bulb globe temperature. This is similar to what you'll hear for the heat stress index when you listen to the news, or when they say it's 100 degrees outside but it feels like it's 105. What we're doing in industrial hygiene is really trying to mimic what kind of heat load a person is working at so that we can keep that M plus or minus R plus or minus C minus E as close as we can to 0 so that the core temperature doesn't change. And what we're measuring here is the dry bulb temperature. This is your normal thermometer, a natural wet bulb temperature, and that's that probe that has cotton on it and will measure both wind velocity and evaporation in terms of how the bulb temperature will be affected under those conditions, and the globe temperature, and that's that big sphere where you're measuring radiant heat. And notice that of those temperatures, the most important is the natural wet bulb, because relative humidity and air velocity are going to play a huge role in how well a person can sweat under those environmental conditions. And so this is given the most weight of all of the different components that are being measured. In fact, if you're measuring this outdoors, the equation is 0.7 times the temperature of the natural wet bulb plus 0.2 times the temperature of the globe, which is that sphere that measures radiant heat, plus 0.1 times the dry bulb temperature, which is the normal thermometer. So our normal thermometer that we look outside and say, hey, it's 85 degrees outside, that is only 10% of our heat stress index that we use in industrial hygiene. And if we take the same measurement indoors, we just drop the dry bulb temperature. We don't even care about the thermometer. All we're interested in is the natural wet bulb, which is still 0.7 or 0.7 of the total contribution of the temperatures, as well as 0.3 times the globe temperature. And I'll go over a problem on this in class so that you know how to calculate these using the measurements that are made. And this is a chart that is gives you some indications. This is in Celsius on if you have a relative humidity of a certain amount, what will be the relative wet bulb temperature from temperature and relative humidity. And it says on the bottom, this table is compiled from an approximate formula which depends on temperature and humidity. The formula is valid for full sunshine and a light wind. And it gives you an indication, and you can kind of see the extremes, that if the temperature is 20 degrees Celsius and it is 100% humidity, your wet bulb globe temperature is going to be 24. Whereas if it's 0% humidity, your wet bulb globe temperature is going to be 15. So you have fully 9-degree range under one temperature based upon what the relative humidity is going to be. And when here in the summertime it gets over 90%, that's going to be significantly hotter than comparable temperatures at relative humidity below 10%. And you can just look at this chart and verify those numbers. Now, there are other environmental measurements that can be made rather than the wet bulb globe temperature. And I mentioned one earlier, the heat stress index that's utilized. That is something that the weather channels tend to use. But another thing that can be done is what we're trying to do by this environmental assessment is make sure that the core temperature is not increased by more than 1 degree. So you could measure the core temperature. And this is actually done in some cases. There are some types of probes that can be used in the workplace where the person can clip temperature on their ear and get a pretty good assessment of what their core temperature is, and that may be used. The best measurement you could get is a rectal thermometer measurement, but there is a resistance of many workers to utilize that. However, there have been some new probes that have come out in the last year or two where people will swallow a temperature probe and they can get a core temperature. And it's kind of interesting if you watch any bicycle racing, the Tour de France the last 2 years, they've actually used this. And the team cars will have core body temperature of all of the athletes transmitted in real time back to the team managers, so they know how hard their athlete is working. And when it's a really, really hot day and they're climbing a hill, they can try to tell them, slow it down a little bit, your core temperature is going up, and you can get a real-time measurement on that. So that's something that the technology is available currently to utilize. Other physiological measurements that can be done, sometimes you can weigh a person before and after and make sure that they don't lose more than a certain percentage of their body weight due to sweating, and that could be a good surrogate measurement for prevention of heat stress. So there are other methods that can be utilized as well, and some of those are discussed in your reading assignment. Now, in terms of what to do about heat stress, we don't have a regulation. We have guidelines, and ACGIH has guidelines, NIOSH has guidelines. OSHA generally uses a general duty clause, but there are no specific regulations set for prevention of heat stress. And so I want to go through a little bit on what ACGIH recommends and what NIOSH recommends. They're a little bit different, but they have some similar approaches on what their recommendations are. This is an ACGIH type of an approach, and one of what it's looking at is acclimatation. And what this is when can you get into a hot environment and work all day long? And if you're a new worker, you can look on the far right for new. The first day you should work 20% in a hot environment. Second day 40%. Third day 60%. And not until 5 days of working can you be 100% into that hot environment. For an experienced worker, if you're gone a few days, the first day you should maybe take it a little easy and work 50% in that environment, but by day 4 you can be back to 100%. And down at the bottom is a reacclimatization schedule after a person has been away from work for various reasons. If they're gone for an illness, you want to ease them in a little bit more slowly. If they're just gone for a vacation, you can ease them in pretty quickly if it's a routine absence. So we have a chart there that takes into account how long they've been away from work, and if they've been sick while they've been away from work, on getting them to work in that hot environment again and how quickly they can do it. This is another ACGIH example which talks about the wet bulb globe temperature, and this is both in Celsius and in Fahrenheit, that are measured, and what kind of a work schedule you can have under those environmental conditions. For example, the first line of continuous work, and I'll use just the Celsius. You can work light at 30 degrees Celsius, and this would be for an 8-hour day. You can work moderate at 26.7 degrees Celsius, and you can work heavy, hard work, continuously at 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And the difference would be sitting at a desk would be light work, and heavy work might be loading boxes in the back of a truck, something like that. So you can work all day continuous work under those conditions. However, if it starts getting hotter, then they recommend that you come up with a work rest schedule. For example, on the heavy side for the next one, if it's 25.9 degrees Celsius, they recommend working for 75% of the time and resting for 25% of the time each hour. So you'd work 45 minutes, you'd rest 15 minutes. If it gets 2 degrees hotter on the Celsius scale and heavy work, you would work 30 minutes and rest 30 minutes. If it gets to 30 degrees Celsius, they recommend that you work 15 minutes and rest 45. Again, these are recommendations, but it is very serious if people get into heat stroke conditions. This is something that can be fatal. If you read the newspapers or watch the news, you see this happens to athletes every year where they get into heat stroke situations. You don't see it as much for occupational people because it's not reported as widely, but it's a huge problem, especially in a lot of places where people are working outdoors and working hard and doing heavy work. So this is a recommendation that should be considered very carefully for people who are working under these environmental conditions and especially doing heavy work, and if they have any personal risk factors. These are heat stress limits proposed by NIOSH, and what it's looking at, again, it's taking into account whether a person is acclimatized or unacclimatized, and they're looking at the wet bulb globe temperature versus the metabolic rate of work, meaning heat production, and they're giving some recommendations on how a person can work under those specified conditions. Now, what do we do about it? How do you control heat stress? Well, you can set up environmental controls. You could turn on fans and get more air movement, and that's going to be very beneficial in helping people sweat from evaporation. You can incorporate work rest schedules like I just went over that are recommended by ACGIH, and these can be very, very helpful. You need to make sure that anybody who's working in a hot environment has access to plenty of fluids, and some people don't like to just drink water, so make sure they drink water that has some type of electrolyte replacement in it as well. And there are some PPE that's available to work under these hot conditions. Some ice-cooled vests or different types of equipment that will help the core temperature decrease can be very useful. And that concludes my discussion on heat stress.